Roadhog is by far the worst and most damaging character to ever be released in Overwatch. Now that's a damn bold claim, because if there's anything that Overwatch is renowned for, it's terrible design, glacial balancing, and above all fumbling the bag on one of the most promising IPs ever released. In fact, when Overwatch players actually say, "we have the worst hero ever released in a game ever," nobody else even bothers to argue. But there's bold, in-your-face, breaking into your house through your window damaging, and then there's the type of damaging which gnaws at the foundations. One of these options is theoretically fixable, even if the landlord doesn't do it for over 2 years, and one is so hard to notice that the house can start listing to the side before anyone realizes. Roadhog has and always will focus around the hook, of which the insta-kill follow-up has been retooled, removed and re-implemented such a ridiculous amount of times that it borders on hilarious. The combo has always been janky. If there's any awards here, it's probably for the most reworked ability in a game which still has the exact same intended purpose as it had before the reworking. Honestly, it's not even clear how many times the hook has been changed, because personally I get the impression that on top of the actual "we fix the hook" patches, there's just as many behind the scenes adjustments and micro changes that don't make it to the patch notes. One must imagine the devs happy recoding the same ability for the 8th consecutive year to avoid edge cases. And I mean, jank isn't a designing crime in and of itself, especially after it's been fixed, and hook is mostly consistent now. The problem isn't the jank, it's the fact that every time the instant kill hook combo gets removed from the game, the player base for the hero drops off a cliff and he either ends up abandoned in general, or more often the combo gets reinstated pretty fast. This has happened over and over again at this point, with the latest time being the release of Season 9, where they once again decreased the hook drop-off range to make the kill more consistent. The full rework to his kit 6 months ago has been widely regarded as an absolute failure in addressing really any of the pain points with his kit. The community sentiment at the moment is that the character is so unhealthy for the game that he should never be good enough to even see regular play. It seems the devs have given up on helping the situation, and therefore there's certainly no further improvements on the horizon. So we're stuck here, with a character who wasn't even well conceived when released 8 years ago, who's made almost zero progress since then, and who makes people want to quit the game entirely every time his play rate peaks. Before Overwatch, the hero-based shooter genre was in its infancy. Honestly, Heavy from TF2 was kind of the only real direct inspiration for how tanks might work, and outside the genre, we had very few good examples of what a PvP tank should be. In almost all cases, this role failed miserably because the PvE concepts like holding aggro and mitigation don't even slightly correlate to a PvP game. I mean, after all, people can just choose not to shoot you. If you look very simply at World of Warcraft PvP, the tanks are, as a universal truth, always less of a kill target for burst damage because of the mitigation and health pools, and in order to balance out this lack of being a kill target, they had to be on the whole less lethal and have less burst than normal class specs. This led to the role being, overall, just horribly boring to play with and against. You have low impact, and you by and whole are less effective as a hero than other specs. And I go as far as to say that every iteration of PvP tanks before Overwatch had and still have failed in some way. This is all to say that when coming up with concept for tanks, the devs never really were designing from a place of understanding, because quite frankly, especially in 2016, nobody in any industry understood how to make them. Should they have CC? Should they give resources to others like supports? Should they anchor the team? Should they have shields? All of these answers were always kind of yes and no. The only consistent factors across the cast the devs seemed to have locked down at launch was firstly that they should be bigger, and that meant the health bar was pretty much scaled to the model size, and secondly that they should be able to take aggro from the team in some way, shape or form. Some of the ideas they came up with were just clunky. D.Va's original DM on a button instead of a meter felt too easy to bait out and too hard to get consistent value from. Some of these ideas were just not good for the game in general. I mean, the ranged anchor tank playstyle of Orisa was just broken on arrival, because if you make a character who can break a choke aggressively with their mitigation abilities, you've necessarily made a character who can defend a choke really well when standing on good terrain on the other side of it. I think it's really easy and common for people to be smug when talking about these early mistakes, but people forget that Blizzard were, in a very real way, laying the tracks down in front of them as they were going. And this is why it's so stupidly remarkable that one of the most interesting quirks of Overwatch 1's development is that they completely and utterly nailed tanking and tanks so early on in the first development cycle. Reinhardt, Winston, Zarya, D.Va, Hog. Winston and Reinhardt were characters who wanted to do a big, cleaving burst into the enemy team. Zarya and D.Va were characters with big bursty resources, which, whether by design or by lucky accident, could be used to let Winston and Reinhardt cleave and do their big burst deeper and further into the enemy team. These heroes were honest and fun to play, and from that moment onwards, a common opinion which stood all the way up until the end of Overwatch 1 was that the only good metas were ones where these hero combinations were viable in some way. The pedigree equality given by these first 4 tanks was never followed up by concept even slightly as universally well thought of by the community, until arguably I'd say Junker Queen's introduction 6 entire years later. And then we had Roadhog, a fat bastard whose only purpose was to walk around the map, instant killing everything he comes into contact with. And that's what he is. Come rain or shine, 8 years later, he's still exactly the same. And that's the question I want to answer here. Why is he the same, and what implications has that had on the game moving forward as a whole? Honestly, I think that a sizable margin of the blame goes to the hero design process at Blizzard. When they make a character, it's always been commonly known that a lot of weight goes into whatever ends up on the communal mind map of their hero fantasy board. Hero fantasies appear to be their catch-all term to describe aspect of the character which makes them stand out as unique and interesting in the cast. The hero fantasy of Reinhardt probably has something like Paladin, Protector, Hammer, Shield, German, I love him, and other things like that on it. This has been amazing in terms of focusing different elements of the team on the core concepts of heroes, which makes them actually feel good. It's easy to imagine that it allows the different departments to individually work on different parts of a hero and stay on the same page without any one person needing to be CC'd in and approve every step of the process. And that's the genius of the system, a collective set of goals during the design process and the individual freedom for each department to find their own way to represent these goals. But what happens when the stupidest person in the room steals a permanent marker and writes something terrible on the mind map? What do you do when a core aspect of the hero's kit is not only central to the theme design of fantasy, but is also fundamentally broken in both theory and practice? Roadhog's reception on launch was really bad. Reinhardt had shield, Winston had bubble, D.Va and Zarya had DM and projected bubble, but Roadhog had nothing aside from hook, which could obviously help other players. This lack of direct synergy caused a lot of tension in the early days. The player base would repeatedly ask for a shield tank every game on the basis that they were struggling if they couldn't stand in the middle of nowhere like idiots. Luckily, the player base had mostly moved on from that stuff after more than a couple of years to slowly filter down information to the plebs at the mid-ranks, but it does go to show you that it definitely wasn't just the devs who were having trouble with the concept of tanking in a PvP game. Eventually, after moving on from that infancy, we realised that characters like Bull and later Doomfist and Junker Queen, who don't really ever do any backline peeling and don't really ever protect their team, was still doing the tanking job. Because the job of a tank has always been less about mitigation and more about making or holding space for your team and taking away advantageous space for the enemy team. If the enemies aren't near you, they can't dive you. If the enemy's on a bad sightline, they can't shoot you. If you're in a good place, your damage sources are strictly better. And if you're in a good place, the enemies have to use abilities to get that good place off you. But then we kept moving on and people kept getting smarter. Overwatch 2 without the off-tank made people realize really damn fast that it's not the tank's role to make space and the support's job to support and the DPS's job to kill things. Every player on the team takes, uses, and controls space. Cassidy controls space by threatening the sightlines in a 20-meter range, and through the old flash and new magnade, disincentivizing flankers. Bull controls space by booping enemies off good terrain and causing localized pressure on certain areas with slam, and forcing enemies to shoot him or risk him running amok the entire game. Kiriko controls whatever damn space she wants because the idiot with the permanent marker snuck in again and wrote teleport and immunity cooldown on the whiteboard. Overwatch has always been a positioning based shooter first, because when you run everything down to the brass tacks, the first and best advantage you can ever get is an advantage gained by being able to walk to a better place. So, despite the fact that Roadhog is inherently selfish, he has always, since launch, controlled space through moving enemies around through the threat of hook and pressure from his primary fire, which every player on any team can capitalize on by, as I said, walking to a better place. This concept is in many ways why Overwatch is the first game where tanking in PvP actually works, by the way. World of Warcraft PvP and other similar games, including MOBAs, are less three-dimensional and therefore fundamentally just don't care about space control and positioning to even close to the same degree as Overwatch. The concept of tanking in a PvP game only seems to work if denying positioning makes a meaningful difference on your chances to win. But if everyone controls space, what the hell is a tank then? Are they just big DPS who sometimes have mitigation, sometimes boot people, sometimes have shields, sometimes have things like bubbles? Is the only common trait just that they're fat and can spend more time in front and standing on objectives? What's so wrong with Roadhog? Sharpness, volatility, and telegraphing of damage sources. These are all contributing factors to what's really important, and that's lethality. Sharp damage sources hit in bursts instead of gradually and kill from higher health totals, and Ashe hitting headshots is much harder to take a ranged duel with without dying because the damage is coming in bursts of 150 as a headshot. Volatile damage sources are unpredictable in their damage output, and Ashe will hit headshots some of the time, meaning that the incoming damage numbers can be hard to predict and therefore are more likely to kill you in a ranged duel. Telegraph damage sources have a wind up or tell which allows you to react to the threat of them hitting you. The only tell for Ashe's hit scan damage being applied to you instantly at full damage with headshots is that the Ashe is able to see you. These three factors are what combines to make a DPS's damage sources very lethal, and end fights with one or another of the DPS's dying more often than not. And if you look at the tank category, aside from Roadhog, you always found a purposeful lack of sharp and volatile pressure in Overwatch 1. Reinhardt has a consistently flat damage source within his range from his swings with a small bump from his fire strike. Zarya has a consistent damage source which increases linearly with her charge and requires a right click burst either aimed or at melee range as the only volatility in the source. Winston has fairly weak non-sharp pressure, and the only volatility in the ability is his jump and melee being able to put out burst damage. But importantly, for all these heroes, they have a much more telegraphed damage profile which gives you the chance to trade positioning and cooldowns for resources. All brawling tank pressure has telegraphs which happen 3, 4 or 10 seconds before the pressure because they have to walk their asses over to you to apply that pressure. All the dive tank pressure has had telegraphs because of their staging range to you and do weaker, softer or more time-bound pressure due to them having more access to apply that pressure. Everything in the game had been carefully constructed and balanced around these three factors, sharpness, volatility and telegraphing, to make it so that if a DPS wins a 1v1 fight, someone dies, but if a tank wins a 1v1 fight, unless people disrespect the space of the tank or forget to press their buttons, people move around, trade resources and live. So, Roadhog. Hook is obviously one of the sharpest abilities in the game, nobody's debating that, and guarantees a kill if landed on almost any target. The only thing that can bail out a hook is kind of Suzu, Lamp, Life Grip, DM, Bubble, that sort of stuff. But regardless of whether those are used, when remember they may not even be present on the team to begin with, the person can still die due to the displacement of the hook. It also stuns after contact, meaning that there's no personal counterplay whilst being hooked, breaking the ability of the majority of the class to use cooldowns and resources to trade for space. It's sharp. Hook is also a skill shot, so it sometimes does nothing and sometimes is a hard wall of guaranteed death depending on how the Roadhog's feeling, meaning that even between matches and between players, the ability is massively volatile in its pressure output. You might say, Ralph, sure, you're right on the others, but Hook's telegraph is slow enough to be reactable and blockable with abilities or walls, and Roadhog still has to be able to see you, be within 20 meters range, and has to have Hook off cooldown. And yes, sure, all of this, you are right. But the fact that he does have a moderate telegraph is complicated massively by the fact that he's a tank. In fact, I'm happy to argue that lethal pressure on a character like Roadhog is a fundamentally bad idea which causes massive gameplay problems which are completely unsolvable. There's actually 5 untenable problems it introduces, so let's go through them. Poor telegraphing and high volatility given to tanks makes the pressure zone, or area of death if you stand here without using stuff, uncertain or unpredictable, or at the very least requires more of a player in order to properly understand when and where they're allowed to stand. Overwatch is a hero-based shooter and therefore, needless to say, has a massive onboarding knowledge issue to begin with, especially when it comes to reading pressure zones from abilities. A great microcosm of the issue is when the top professional aimers used to come into Overwatch and get dumpstered by plat lobbies. This is a real issue for the game, and one of the main problems with hero-based shooters in general. When you don't have a proper understanding of ranges, abilities, heroes, game sense, that thing, the entire game feels pretty much arbitrary and, as some would say, absolute bullshit. With Ashe and Widow, people get it though. I stood on their sightline, I risked dying, I could technically kill them back if I was able to click them better. But people are a lot less forgiving when the stakes for them are certain death, and the stakes for the enemy are wait 7 seconds and give it another go. I think it's a pretty clear, straight line argument to say that in places where pressure zones through ability usage like Hook are volatile and more untelegraphed, we're gonna be making this onboarding problem for new players a lot worse. I think the second big problem with Roadhog is that having a larger health pool gives him access to move around his pressure zones and therefore make them less consistent and readable for the enemy, further causing problems with telegraphing and volatility. There is literally nothing more disempowering as a player than knowing about your death 4 seconds in advance and having nothing you can do about it, or being forced away from areas because you have to hedge your bets on a 30% chance you might die at random. This is a problem with sustain and interactability. There's two real possibilities here. Firstly, in the case where Roadhog doesn't have enough resources to run across the field at will and hook someone around a corner, the player base is largely incentivized to shoot Roadhog to stop him doing his bullshit. In that case, the player of Roadhog is forced to largely be inactive, sit behind cover and fish off cooldown, which is boring. And the alternative case is that Roadhog has so many resources and so much sustain that there's no real chance to ever burn him down, in which case the player base is incentivized to on the whole just completely ignore him and largely just move away from the unstoppable monster going around and insta-killing people. So for the most part, Roadhog is and always has been balanced around this knife edge, because if somebody picks higher damage to burn his health bar or picks specific abilities which interact with him well, such as Sleep Nade, Discord Spear, Rock, etc., he can be kicked immediately out of the second mode of bullshit and directly into the first mode of being completely inactive. So sure, Hook is telegraphed, but the moment that Roadhog becomes unchecked in the game, the telegraph just simply doesn't matter anymore, and he'll kill you anyway, anywhere you're standing. This feeds back again into volatility in his pressure. If he can go from stomping a lobby to completely inert really damn fast due to specific hero-based counters, how is a new person supposed to predict or deal with this pressure without feeling cheated? They simply can't. So what do new players do on average if the pressure zone seems inconsistent and therefore makes your death feel like complete bullshit? Especially in low ranks, what I've seen from thousands of reviews is the obvious. People just space further around it so that they're clearly out of the uncertain death area. And this naturally comes with all the standard negative effects of spreading out in Overwatch. It makes the game about who can win the straight resource trade on the target in front they can shoot, something counter swapping, or makes the game about waiting for sharp long range spam damage to get another kill. And if sharp long range spam damage is the main solution, the tanks and supports are necessarily cosmetic, and even the DPS don't enjoy the game. This is boring and tiring gameplay and plays exactly into the game's weaknesses. Nobody likes being forced to sit at 100 yards range waiting for kills. People like dynamic mid-range fights and active resource trades. But really quick at medium ranks, it becomes pretty clear that spreading out to avoid instant death mechanics is a really bad idea. You know, a Junkertown where there's an attacking Widow and nobody ever takes a duel, nobody ever peeks cover, and you lose to her regardless despite her getting no kills because she controlled the entire map by existing. The actual answer to sharp volatile pressure isn't to entirely avoid the pressure, it's to call out periods of low pressure, challenge them at an advantage, and make sure they don't get free map control. So people should be disrespecting Roadhog's Hook to various degrees, because if you respect the 50% of Hook's Roadhog's bound to miss, you've given up 100% of the space for free. So there's an incentive here to play within the Hook range, properly around cover, and we're left in the curious situation where lower medium ranked players are either not interacting with the Hook at all and playing a more boring game for it and losing at long range, or interacting with Hook and winning the game at the cost of being arbitrarily killed by something they don't yet have the skill to track and predict. All scenarios here are just bad for the game. There is the classic response people give. Just get better, start predicting the pressure, start tracking the cooldown, start seeing what he can or can't get away with. But to start with, there's obviously at least one person on the battlefield who doesn't really have that option. Roadhog, because of the extreme sharpness of the ability, has always been a tank buster. Not necessarily in terms of the ability to break through armor anymore. In fact, the new recent breakthrough of the dev team in reverting the armor back to the old Overwatch 1 version where it reduces damage from pellet type weapons more is a welcome change. I mean, one might wonder if it might have actually originally been that way for a good reason before it was arbitrarily changed to a 30% reduction when Overwatch 2 was released. But if I'm going to start listing the arbitrary changes for Overwatch 2 which have been reverted, we'd be here all day. Let's hope they revert one more change. The point is, if landed on a tank, sometimes even more than if landed on a DPS, Hook guarantees the fight win simply due to the displacement. In order to withstand a landed hook, you either need some sort of infinite damage block, such as Sigma or Diva, or enough movement in your kit that you can counteract the displacement from the hook. Especially the Brawl tanks Ram, Junker Queen, Reinhardt, Zarya in particular are screwed by such a sharp ability. So you might say, Ralph, nobody needs to block the hook with an ability. Wolves are shields, you dummy, and sure, but that's just skipping the problem. Because you're right, I can play around the hook. People at high level have learned the range and learned to closely watch the movement and the damage going into him to see what his limitations are on the ability to literally come and get you, but that ignores the fact that using cover appropriately is one of the most difficult things to learn in the game, and represents a really high skill flaw that importantly completely eclipses the actual skill required to fire out the hook on cooldown at the big target on the enemy team. And what are we even talking about here? Is being forced to stand behind a wall every single time the hook is off cooldown, or else flirt with an instant death mechanic, really something that's good gameplay in the first place? And if you don't want to stand behind a wall, and instead, I don't know, want to contest an objective maybe, which I've heard tanks sometimes do like to do, you're forced to hold mitigation abilities and blocks to the hook, creating a stalemate situation. Okay, have you ever played that gladiator game where you have a beam that you're on and a double-ended foam stick to hit the other person off with? People very quickly realize, and I very quickly realized, that attempting to hit the other person off the beam is almost always the incorrect choice because it destabilizes you so much. And you always end up with one smug bastard against you who just waits for you to throw yourself off balance without even moving. If you play long enough, you both start learning that standing there and not doing anything is commonly the best option. If the enemy's on Roadhog, you either play touching cover or stalemate with abilities, being completely inactive and literally just waiting for our DPS to do something interesting. The game is slow, boring, you do nothing, and then if you miss up once, you die instantly. All you can do is sit and wait. So I'd be completely remiss to mention at the moment that all of these problems with Roadhog that I've already stated are completely and utterly compounded by the swap to 5v5. One of the effects of tanks which are kind of underrepresented in discussion nowadays is their ability to simply stabilize and even out sharp pressure. Spam damage from Junkrat, Fire Symmetra and chokes, which players had to walk through whilst being spammed, used to be a major part of the game previously. And whilst we all agree this was terrible design space, previously the two tanks did help to mitigate the worst of it. Sharp pokey damage was also shut down massively by tanks, Widow and Hanzo in particular, because even if you ignore the extra ability mitigation in the game, at its base level in a random ranked lobby, if you have two guys that might do something like shut down a Widow, it's more likely to happen more often. This was, by the way, one of the reasons people wanted Reinhardt's shield to stand behind. There was a lot more sharp or spam damage in the game, and community education was low enough that they didn't know how to play around any of it without the shield. Naturally, adjustments have been made to the format to account for this. By and large, projectiles have been sped up and splash damage reduced to even out the chances of deaths due to random bullshit. Community education has gone up massively as well, and what was once an impossibility in gold like don't look at the Widow without clicking her, has now reached the hands of mere mortals. But that doesn't stop the truth that having less tanks on the field means that there is both less checking of the enemy Roadhog's positioning and less checking of the hook's ability to access backlines and kill once it has accessed the backline. I won't spill more ink on this topic, I'm moving on. As with all extreme designs like Widow, Junkrat, Hanzo Zen, and Roadhog, all of the areas of the design space which were always somewhat problematic in 6v6 have often without significant tweaks become unhealthy in the current format. So yeah, the character has massive innate problems due to the lethal pressure design generated 8 years ago, which have always had negative ramifications on the gameplay, and these problems have been compounded with the swap to 5v5. So, we got a full rework. Yay! Let's knock a couple of the easy aspects out. Due to other parts of this kit being terrible to play against and the character now needing to do stuff like contest points and generally stand out in the open in 5v5, quite a lot of the power in this kit has been simply moved over time into sustain and ability to just exist. We all know why high sustainability is bad, all you have to do is look at the other tank rework and you get the point. Unkillable heroes are uninteractive and infinite sustain is possibly the worst type of power to ever give a hero. I mean, Breather has, over the years, gone from a root with no damage reduction, to being able to use it freely whilst walking, to being able to use it freely with damage reduction, to now being able to use it freely whilst on a meter with damage reduction without it being interruptible. I'd argue that this aspect of the rework, combined with the same treatment for Whole Hog, have somehow managed to make the design of one of the worst designed heroes in the game directly worse. Naturally, with more sustainability comes not only more ability to stand on point, but more ability to walk into your backline and hook someone minding their own business, and Breather is definitely a prime suspect for that. But Whole Hog now does one thing and one thing only: delete the enemy tank on cooldown, barring DM, Grasp, and a couple other abilities. It just guarantees a kill. The reason for this change is easy to see. If you have Whole Hog and they have Rock, Spear, or another stun, you literally cannot use it. So the fight turns into another ability stalemate, because the other player's stun will just get held forever until inevitably you use it and get stunned out. Before, the stalemating issue was less extreme because Roadhog in 6v6 was an off-angler, meaning you could use the ult in places where the stuns weren't, or alternatively, you had another tank who can give you protection during the ult. But nowadays, the best way to prevent Roadhog one-hitting your entire backline if you're the enemy tank is to mirror him and stay on his angle. This means that Roadhog is almost by definition on main the majority of the time, and on main you can't dodge the stuns when they're the only target the stuns have any interest in following. So in my mind, Blizzard's fix was the obvious path of least resistance. Making Whole Hog and Breather just not interact with their worst counters solved the stalemating issue. But again, this reduced the interactability of the game and made Whole Hog a one-size-fits-all to leave the tank ability. I think the question to ask is, was there another fix here? And my answer personally is pretty simple and pretty sad: there really wasn't much else to be done. All channeled tank ultimates, which need constant LOS with the enemies in order to get their value, need some other way to stop stuns interacting with them when you remove the other tank. This problem is so intractable that even non-tanks who aren't being mirrored by the stuns and don't have to be in melee range to use their channeled abilities, e.g. Moira's Coalescence, have now had these type of changes too. As always when discussing 5v5, yet another region of regular design space have been rotted out and made unhealthy by the more simplified format. There's no real other fix for this issue than reworking or changing the ultimate. So let's just add that to the pile of reworks Blizzard are never going to get around to for their new format. The primary fire rework was also interesting, but a bit of a wash by the hole. The left and right click previously being split created a healthy skill curve to play the character, and the rework removed that depth, making it easier for players to abuse Roadhog at a low level. But the rework did also tackle problems with the volatility of Roadhog's damage, because he used to randomly get skillful insta-kills when the right click just so happened to line up with a character's head by accident. It was important to remove the dead zone between right click and left click when transitioning to solo tanking, but I do personally miss the old fire mode, so let's move on. The real interesting part of the rework, and why we're here in the first place, is the pigpen. The stated top goal of the rework as a whole was as follows. Quote, "The broad goal of the Roadhog rework was to improve his frontline presence on the battlefield as a tank hero and reduce the frustration enemy players had with how consistently deadly his hook combo has been in the past." Despite the fact that the stated goal of the rework was to, quote, "improve his frontline presence," instead I preferred to focus on the rest, and the complete and utter failure of the rework to do what really mattered, which clearly was to reduce the frustration enemy players had with how consistently deadly his hook combo has been in the past. And if there's any one part of the rework that may have been designed to do that, it's clearly the pigpen. Their description of the logic for pigpen is here, quote, "This enables Roadhog to have control over a wider area, and with a little bit of pre-planning can be used to either help protect his allies or further enhance the effectiveness of his hook combo." The idea is pretty simple: split the ability into two parts. First, make the instant kill combo not possible by moving the hook target further away when they're pulled in. Secondly, make the other part of the combo, the trap, have to be pre-placed in order to be able to do the instant kill. This, in theory, solves a couple of problems. The trap is a tell that the hook combo is active, or a telegraph, meaning that not only does Hog have to set up trap before hooking, giving you time to react, but you can avoid sightlines within a distance of the trap rather than in distance of a moving Hog. It also moves soft team play into Hog's kit because the slow gives time for the teammates to contribute to the kill. It's pretty genius as a concept. Roadhog has a hero fantasy which involves a one-shot hook combo. In fact, every time you remove the one-shot hook combo, people stop playing him, and this change allows you to, in theory, keep his identity whilst making that hook a lot more telegraphed in a world where ways to stop it or play around it are a lot fewer. You get to have your cake and eat it too, a less sharp, less volatile, more telegraphed version of the hook, which still has the one shot which Hog players love, still has all of the hero fantasy intact, and stops his limitless access to space, making other players' life hell. So what the hell went wrong? Because we're 2 years later and Hog can one shot again without the trap. Well, the first problem is telegraphing. Pigpen as a telegraph for hook is really bad. It's a tiny trap that can be shot, and therefore, when you have a trap that can be shot, you can't put it in the open because people can shoot it. So where do you put it? Well, you put it behind a damn wall, that's where you put it. And with Hog's turning range seemingly going up to like 180 degrees or so, and Hog's throwout animation for the Pigpen also being relatively low profile, and it making very little noise when it's dropped, and it having no glow effect or anything else around it, the telegraph may as well not exist at a low level. And at high level, it's even worse because the trap is so obvious that when you understand the game, you know exactly where the trap is without seeing it. Somewhere vaguely behind a wall near Roadhog is always a pretty good guess. The second problem it didn't solve was sharpness. The traps combo did reduce the lethality against DPS pretty well, but for the tanks, the displacement was already the lethal part of the hook, so what happens when you do nothing to affect the part of the hook that actively matters to them, and then put a slow effect on them once they get there? It's literally even worse than it was before. The Roadhog just turns into even more of a tank counter swap. And thirdly, the run you down and hook you wherever you're standing gameplay still worked exactly the same because the actual execution of the trap was completely flubbed. It deploys so fast that you can literally just throw it down, hook immediately after, and use it anywhere you want. If you're doing that fat bastard Roadhog thing, which he always could because he's a tank by running through the entire map to get you, it doesn't matter if the hook is slightly more telegraphed, because a telegraph wasn't the trap, it was the fact that Roadhog started running towards you 5 seconds ago. The only real progress the combo made in reality was slightly increasing the skill floor of the hook combo by essentially ensuring that you have to not waste the trap on something random before you want to hook, and that you remember to press that one button before hooking. So I mean, yeah, it worked a little bit, the telegraph was in place, and I guess Roadhog was less lethal to DPS players. Now, I don't work at Blizzard, I don't have in-depth player number statistics, I am only a sage capable of reading between the lines, and it's pretty obvious in retrospect to me what happened next. So to explain the rest of the story, we have to turn no longer to the gameplay, but to the meta. So, the rework went in. All of this, all the whining about the hook, all of the complaining about hard pressure and volatility really belies what I'm sure you've been all saying in your head since the video started. None of this was ever an accident. The hook, the self-sustain, the survivability, the selfishness, Roadhog was and has always been, completely on purpose, a magnet for DPS players who want to moonlight in the tank role to give them an option which fits more around what they normally enjoy doing. And that sounds absolutely fine on the surface. It sounds like it wouldn't cause any problems whatsoever. Blizzard has pitched their entire theory of mind in terms of how to make a character on the mind map and on the hero fantasy, but every time they try and work around it to make the combo less sharp, I mean, the win rate for Roadhog doesn't drop off that much, but the player numbers drop off a cliff, exactly as the numbers did this time, exactly as they always have. Because when you make a fantasy or a mind map or a plan for a character, what you actually make isn't always just the contents of the whiteboard. At this late hour, I can finally reveal to you the real problem with Roadhog, hiding just below the surface the entire time. The insidious force undermining every step made towards making Roadhog more reasonable, removing every chance of the insta-kill hook being rubbed off the whiteboard. Let's rip the band-aid off and speak some actual truth here. The players who play Roadhog don't care about the hook, they don't care about the selfishness, they don't care about the heal, they don't care about being fat, they don't care about the lore or the fantasy or the hero design at all. The players who play Roadhog only care about stomping a lobby. And I know this is the case because this is exactly the player base Blizzard has purposely courted over the years. On top of everything else, we have always had to deal with the result of DPS players moonlighting in the tank queue, compounding every single problem with his kit, because when you make a tank lethal, you make all of the components that makes a character good to smurf on better. He's by far the best solo carry in the game and has been since the game's launch, and if you're even slightly better than the enemy team, you can run tank queue while ignoring all tank synergy and gameplay without breaking a sweat at 60% plus win rate. This has always been compounded by the fact that a player from a different category looking to play tank will necessarily have their tank SR stagnant, so will necessarily be competing against people lower than them in skill and smurfing if they do pick tank. And then it was compounded again when the priority pass forced players into the tank role at the end of Overwatch 1, who all, by and whole, chose the character they could carry on the most to get their passes the fastest. And that's the problem, the core, fundamental, unchangeable problem at the center of everything with this character. This is the audience Blizzard has courted for 8 years. And this is the audience you get when you purposely design a character to ruin the lobby for your duo tank, for your team, for the enemy tanks, for the enemy DPS, for everyone but you. You get the dregs, you get the lowest common denominator, not interested in learning how to play tank, not interested in push or pull, not interested fundamentally in tanking. And the worst part for Blizzard, when you as a company spend 8 years courting players into playing a role that they don't want to play simply because you gave them a pragmatic reason to play it in the ability to stomp lobbies, and then you remove the only reason they were playing it, the lethality, they don't want to play with you anymore. So it is as it was, as it always will be, when the hook one-shot was removed and turned into a combo with the trap. The only thing that has ever happened occurred again. Players played something else, the play rate of Roadhog went down, and eventually the one-shot was reinstated without any necessity of the pig pen, and Roadhog continues to be terrible. This video is, was, and never has been, and is currently not about Roadhog. Somewhere along the line, somewhere in the fog, in the midst of everything, we lost sight of what tanks were. You could say that maybe we never knew, that the design of tanks was based not on objective factors, but that completely and accidentally, Blizzard somehow managed to make tanks in Overwatch 1 aside from Roadhog apply not hard, but soft, telegraphed, non-sharp, or non-volatile pressure. But I'm not buying it. Somewhere deep, they clearly knew, because the designs are just so consistent. But then we moved on to Overwatch 2, and that was all thrown out the window, because Blizzard had a great new idea. Since Overwatch 2, the tank category in Overwatch has almost exclusively shifted in the direction of lethality and therefore lack of telegraphing, more volatile and more sharp pressure. And I think this is the core reason for so many problems in the game right now. In Overwatch 1, Reinhardt had a clearly telegraphed, low volatility, relatively high sharpness zone of pressure, which he could not only be stunned out of by a large proportion of the cast, but couldn't cancel. He had no way to create lethal pressure unless the enemy team simply disrespected his space. Even when you include Lucio into the mix, the boundaries may be larger on his pressure, but they're always readable and certain. With one change, one seemingly insignificant change, the charge cancel, Reinhardt went from fair to unfair. He can now completely and arbitrarily, with very little risk, charge on cooldown, crossing his fingers that he pins you, and if he doesn't, simply cancel the ability and kill you anyway. The only way to stop this happening as a DPS is to increase your knowledge on exactly what is possible for the Reinhardt, space yourself around the possibility of charge, play within range whilst holding survivability or movement cooldowns, or to very importantly and uninterestingly, to damage the Reinhardt and counterpick them till the point where they can no longer just charge and kill you. Zarya used to have one readable personal bubble which could be tracked by anyone at a low level. With one seemingly insignificant change, Zarya went from fair to unfair. Now in Overwatch 2, Zarya has 2 personal bubbles, and as far as low level players or players who haven't seen how many bubbles she's used off screen are concerned, she will now arbitrarily have 2 bubbles when it's the least convenient to them and kill them at random. So players do what? Repeat after me, space yourself out further, play within range and stalemate abilities, or counterpick the Zarya to reduce how far she can chase around corners. Orisa used to have counterplay to a pull, which was by and large an unhealthy ability, but at least it had a massive telegraph in the slow travel time and delay before the pull, and this was replaced by a spear which can literally combo across the map to insta-kill people with a stun combo with no interactability included. Doomfist has been given Empowered Punch, which can arbitrarily kill people from across the map due to completely no fault of their own if somebody else had just shot him for a couple of seconds. Winston was given a much bigger entry combo into his leaps, giving him a much larger damage spike. Ramatra has been given Vortex, which vastly complicates and changes the safe range to play away from him for low ranked players, and we also have the other solo tanking effect, every character is bigger, which means that where before, if a tank overextended into space which was too hard to take or hold, they'd get burned down in a duel and potentially killed, now all characters, even those who haven't had obvious mobility creep like D.Va, can arbitrarily kill any DPS on an off angle because they have no feasible way of fighting her off, creating a chilling effect on anyone positioning in an interesting manner. All of these effects, all of the reduction in telegraphing for pressure zones, all of the increase in sharpness of the damage sources, all of the increase in volatility of the characters, all of the extra health which could be arbitrarily used to force a kill where otherwise it would only have forced a trade, they created exactly the same thing Roadhog did and always has done. They increased the skill floor to exist without being arbitrarily blown up with no warning, they spaced out the game to account for the potential to be lethally blown up, and they forced people to play in uncertain pressure zones where they might be killed at random, leading to massive ability stalemating in case the tank chooses to randomly all in on them for no reason. Zarya being able to double bubble herself is bad design, Reinhardt being able to charge cancel is bad design, Doomfist being able to insta-kill you whilst being in the tank category due to somebody else charging your power block is bad design, Marissa's javelin and her spin being able to completely shut down the enemy broad tank with sharp pressure, forcing them to always conserve resources and never regress in a never-ending stalemate and burn down is bad design, Roadhog being in the game from the release of Overwatch 1 8 years ago until now has been bad design. All of the things I've mentioned make the game lesser for their inclusion, especially for a new player who doesn't have a proper read on ability effects, pressure zones and telegraphs. All of the things mentioned are the reason why beloved maps like King's Row are by and whole pretty hated nowadays, and the reason why we can't even have one small section of one map be slightly closed off with glass.
Just a funny little rant.
I have no idea how the devs took the worst part of the worst character in Overwatch history and decided that that was what they wanted to replicate. But here we are, 8 years later, and every day the tanks tend towards being less telegraphed, more sharp, more volatile, more lethal. So the question is obviously why? Why are they doing this? Why can't tanks apply soft pressure anymore? Why do they have to be lethal in order to be valid? And I guess the only answer you can really give here is, we need to go back to Roadhog. Back to the first thing Blizzard realised they could do to court DPS players into playing tank when role queue was introduced. Never mind that they don't really want to interact with a role, never mind that they don't care to learn, never mind that they are only there to stomp lobbies, because if the tank player base numbers check out in the short term, I guess the problem is solved. Now the scariest part here is everything we've already learned from Pigpen. You can give people lethality, but you can't take it away, because the players who are using the characters for their lethality aren't playing for the character fantasy or enjoyment of the mechanics, they're playing for the lethality. They're playing because the character is unfair, they're playing to stomp lobbies. Now there's some great light at the end of the tunnel here, because Blizzard sure as hell think that there's no way to increase tank pick rates without making them more lethal and therefore have more positive reinforcement through hit markers and kills. But you only need one counterexample to disprove a theory or a rule. There's one hero who proves that above all, you do not need to design characters like this in order to create a compelling gameplay loop and a respectable player base. My precious, my perfect, my beautiful queen, surely there's a reason people universally like your design. If you want to see how to make things fun and engaging without making them lethal or unfair, just think about it. Knife has the same telegraph as Hook, but it doesn't kill, it doesn't stop you using abilities to counteract the stick, it even has a delay before you can pull, it's soft pressure, it gives you chances to play against it and gives you chances to trade resources instead of lives. Carnage has a wind up, it only does set damage based on her being in range of you, cleaves to give happy brain feelings when it hits, and the woman even yells before she uses it most of the time to telegraph that it's coming. If you die to Queen, it's because you ignored or failed to play around obvious telegraph pressure zones. It's your fault, it's fair, that's what we want, that's what we all need. Predictable, cleanly defined pressure zones that you can either trade resources to stay in or move out of cleanly if you want to. But what we have now is the opposite. Every tank is more or less, in one way or another, for better or worse, Roadhog, and every step in this direction makes the game universally worse off for all roles. So that, after all of this time, is how I justify saying that Roadhog has caused more damage to the game than any other hero, and fundamentally, why he's terrible. Hey, so this was meant to be a quick thing I made in a weekend to explain a simple character so that I could move on and make other commentary on supports and the priority pass, etc. Clearly it's gotten away from me, Jesus Christ, like 25 pages and counting. The weirdest thing is that I've actually cut a sizable bunch of stuff out of the video. There's even like more issue with the character, I can't even make it into here. Let me thank some people in the background while I ramble more. I run a 6v6 pug every Sunday at 4 PM BST, and we currently have one hero rework project per week. If you want to learn more about that, go here. I hope I didn't belabor points too much. I'm sure you can see I'm pretty passionate on the lethality of tanks being bad, but generalizing it to other tanks will be a pretty controversial topic in the community, so I wanted to explain it in depth, because on top of being controversial, it's not really one of the issues that's under much discussion at the moment. Especially the high level players are going to kick back against this because they really enjoy things like Reinhardt's charge, but as I've said, you can give people a toy but you can't take it away without them getting annoyed. Now, you might say that this extension to the pressure cycles of the tanks from Bubble and DM and Shout, etc. in the 6v6 format used to be pretty similar to the volatile pressure currently put out in all tanks kits. This is kind of true, but there's a big difference in readability for a new player who gets hit by a Reinhardt because he has a Zarya bubble, because they didn't notice the enemy team had a Zarya, and being killed by a Zarya because you didn't know she had two bubbles and she walked you down with both of them. One's a read on the heroes, one's a read on the game state. I think the latter is a lot more frustrating, especially when the read on the game state might not always be possible. The other thing is that teamwork scales with rank, meaning that as you go up in rank, the power of the Reinhardt Zarya couple scales as the bubble is better timed, whereas the ability to run someone down with two bubbles doesn't really scale in the same way. In terms of abusability of certain characters to get a high win rate while smurfing, the fact that a tank who smurfing can put out much sharper pressure compared to a player at the same rank is a real problem, and does make lower ranked players rely much more on countering than is necessary. There's a reason that every player focuses on moving tanks from the kill everything and be ignored mode to the does nothing in his passive mode, and it's that the entire community has independently decided since 2016 that lethal tanks are not fun to play against. As to what could be done to increase tank play rates, it's pretty simple, because you can put more power into tanks without making them feel terrible to play against when they're morphed there and don't have this lethal pressure. If you cut out all of the bullshit deficit tanks, then you can also cut out the counter swaps, which give players like a modicum of counterplay to being randomly killed by raid bosses. Thank you for listening to me. I will be back soon. Apologies for it being so long since the last one. Hopefully I'll be able to get these out a little bit faster in the future, but I went to Vegas and lost £18 on the gambling machines. Thanks for listening. Cheers.